I'm really happy to see you all here, and I'm really excited about this opportunity to discuss a very brand new survey that is fresh out, the Global Data Barometer, which in this shape and form is taking place for the first time in the world. Although its predecessor, the Open Data Barometer, has been around for some years, but now it has been refreshed to the extent that we can say that it is a completely new survey, basically. But just to start with a bit of a background, I will give a short overview of who we are and what we are doing here in this data club. I am Maarja Olesk. I'm a member of board of the Open Knowledge Estonia, which is a non-profit working to advance openness and the spread of open knowledge, open information in Estonia, but also in other countries. And we've been collaborating with the Estonian government for several years, trying to advance the open data landscape in Estonia. And we were founded in 2016. By now, we've become a broader hub of activities around data literacy, digital literacy, and we a couple of years ago we launched this new direction or a new program called Andmeklubi or Data School, which then aims to conduct trainings and capacity building to basically spread and advance data literacy in Estonia. And in the framework of the Data School, we have consulted several government organizations, public sector organizations, as well as others. And one sort of activity that grew out of this Data School initiative is also Andmeklubi or Data Club, which is a series of informal meetings dedicated to the open data community, but not only basically data users or civil society, but also then the public sector and other sectors interested in discussing everything data, especially, of course, open data. This event here is part of this series of these data clubs, which we try to keep as informal and free-flowing as possible. So today also we were not having a very formal launch of the Global Data Barometer results here in Estonia, but more of a free-format discussion of what these results mean. And the Global Data Barometer basically then raised the question, how is data used for public good in the world? And of course, what we're especially interested in here in Estonia is how is Estonia doing in international comparison? So these are the two questions we are going to address today. And I'm really, really happy to welcome here Helen Darbishire from Access Info. She's one of the founders and the executive director of Access Info, which is a Madrid-based nonprofit working to advance freedom of information and access to information in Europe and beyond. And Helen has several decades of experience working around freedom of information, freedom of expression, anti-corruption issues as well. And she's currently a member of the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership and has also served in the board of the Open Data Charter. So we're really, really excited to welcome Helen here and to help us put the results into a context. And Access Info was then the organization that served as the sort of the regional hub for data collection on the Open Data Barometer in Europe. So they have a very good overview of how this process went and the results from Europe as well. And our second member of today's conversation is Keegan McBride. He's a postdoctoral researcher at the Hertie School of Governance in Berlin. He has a PhD in public administration from the Tallinn University of Technology, and he has worked several years together with Open Knowledge Estonia, managing the Estonian Open Data Portal, as well as then collecting data about Estonia for the Global Data Barometer. So Keegan has a very good overview of all the questions asked, the responses given, and also some of the methodological aspects of the Global Data Barometer survey, which we may be addressing a bit as well in our today's conversation. But then before we start the conversation between Keegan, Helen, and myself, just a couple of technical issues. So everyone's already familiar with the Zoom code of conduct, I assume, but let's try to keep our mics on mute whenever we're not speaking. Let's try to keep our camera on whenever possible so that we can see each other and feel a bit more like being in a data club discussing data issues amongst ourselves. And if you have any technical problems, please notify us of them using the chat. And if you want to give a comment or ask a question, you can always type them in the chat or use the raise hand function to speak, and then we can give you the floor and make sure that we are speaking one at a time. So a bit of background before we get to discussing the results. The Global Data Barometer, as I said, was launched last year. And it's basically the first of its kind in a sense that it tries to capture a wide variety of indicators that somehow show what is the state of data use in relation to urgent societal issues and to what extent countries are managing data for the public good. So we covered 109 countries, including Estonia, and it covered the period of May 2019 to 2021. So the most recent developments are not captured there yet, but it's still relatively recent data about the past couple of years. And it had several core modules. It looked at governance and capability related to data use. And then it looked at specific sectors or areas in which data is published and used. And these included climate action, company information, health and COVID-19, land, political integrity, public finance, and public procurement. And there were some cross-cutting issues as well, which included sustainable development, openness, data for development, inclusion, gender and diversity, as well as emerging AI practices. And now getting to the results. Estonia then, based on the global ranking, although the Global Data Barometer says that it's not about ranking as much as rating and understanding data use practices, Estonia basically ranks second after the United States in this global in the global results. We can see the country score is 67 out of 100 points, and we're doing relatively well in many of the areas, perhaps not so well in climate action, political integrity, governance, and so on. But this is something that we're going to discuss in a moment. So I will stop sharing the screen now and maybe give the word finally to Helen and Keegan to reflect on what this all means. And perhaps first, Helen, since you have been working on these issues for a long time and you're also representing Access Info, so can you maybe explain us what this new concept of data for public good means and how should we understand this?
Well, thanks. First of all, thanks very much, Maria. And Good afternoon, everybody. It's great to be joining you from Madrid to Estonia this afternoon. Is my sound okay?
Yes.
I've been having a little bit of microphone problems this week, so I had to abandon my microphone. I hope that this works. Fantastic. And there's a bit of an echo in my office too. Sorry about that. Yes. So thank you for the introductions. It's a great pleasure to be representing Access Info with my colleague who's on the call, Marta Mokwende, who really did all the work of coordinating the 27 countries that we covered and helping them process all the data. So I need to acknowledge her role in it. The data for public good. I think essentially all the studies and the evaluations of open data that we had before had possibly two failings. One failing is that they didn't necessarily look at the kinds of data sets which are most useful for helping us address the societal democratic challenges that we have right now. So fighting against corruption, for example, which requires a whole set of integrity instruments, lobby control, assets declarations, transparency of spending of public funds. There are things that weren't necessarily measured beforehand. Or climate data to help us address climate vulnerability data to help us address the challenges of climate change. So there's been more of a focus in this edition of the Barometer, not going for the data sets which are easy to measure necessarily, or the types of data which is easy to measure, but what's important to measure. That is great, but of course it made it a lot harder to really get proper comparable results. And I'm sure that whilst I think we have a huge amount of really useful information in the survey, in the database that you have online, I'm sure that everyone will find one or two things that they could question. And that's something that we'll have to perfect in subsequent editions. The other thing that there hasn't been an attempt to evaluate previously is what kinds of people are making use of the data. Because it's all very well publishing information, but if it's not actually being used, then there's a problem. It's a different kind of problem. But I always remember, and it was about 5 years ago, I was in Zagreb in Croatia talking to someone in the Ministry of Finance. And this lady had, on a hot summer's day, and this lady said that it had taken her months and months to persuade her bosses to set up a kind of user-friendly budget portal where people could download the information in ways that were more accessible to the public. And then eventually let her work on this and collect and process all the data and put it online. And then she said only 6 people had clicked on it. And she was almost crying, you know, because she wasn't going to be allowed to do it again next year. So it's really important for us to understand, and we do see differences. We see different kinds of data being used by different sets of users. So the anti-corruption integrity data tends to be used more by civil society than by businesses, even though actually it could be very useful for businesses to look at this data like public procurement or company registers and so forth. So is the data that is being published really serving to contribute to people's information needs, to an evidence-based debate, to helping people combat fake news? That's something that I think in this first edition, it's been very hard to measure, but at least we've got some ideas about that. So I don't know, I can maybe pause there and see if I've answered, Maarja, your first question before I say anything more. What is data for public good? It's data that exists, that's complete, that's relevant, and that people are actually using, which requires public officials to think about letting people know it's there, training people how to use it. If knowledge is to be open in the name of open knowledge, people need to know how to use that information as well. Does that? I don't know if you want me to carry on. Shall I stop there for a second?
No, you gave a very good answer to the first question, and I really like the definition of data for public good, meaning that data that exists and is really actually also used and is relevant. I think that's a key point. But then looking at the results from the global barometer, how well are countries doing in making this relevant data available and actually promoting use of the data for the public good? How does the overall picture look to you?
Yes, I have to say we got the data, the next data challenge, 6 days ago. This was launched. And there's been a weekend in Spain. We've had a 3-day public holiday weekend in between. So me and my colleagues, we've had 3 days to look at this data, and we're still working on it, to be honest. And I will answer your question, but just with that excuse that I don't have everything memorized yet. And I've got some things up on my screen here. I've been looking at it initially because we have to put out the press release and organize the event for Europe, which we're planning to do a little bit later in June, to give us time to process the data that's been released under the barometer and to have some community conversations, for example, with civil society users, the anti-corruption sector, the environmental sector, investigative journalists. So that's a bit about the sort of plan to promote this. I have to say that, first of all, Europe is doing well compared with other regions of the world. So if we look at it at that level, you showed, I think, the graphic of Estonia against the world, and that's pretty good. Not perfect, but pretty good. You're weaker, for example, on climate action data, and that's a pattern that we're seeing across the whole of Europe, which I think is really interesting. How surprising it is, I'm not sure. Maybe if I worked in an environmental NGO, I wouldn't be remotely surprised. Just like I work in do a lot of anti-corruption work, and I'm not surprised to see that beneficial ownership data is missing, or it's not open in many countries because you have to pay for access. Company registers is a problem in Europe. Lobbying data, well, there's no data because we don't have lobbying registers in lots of countries in Europe. So in some places, this confirms what we probably suspected. I think on the climate vulnerability data, it is really interesting. One pattern that we're definitely seeing, which I think is interesting to think about and take into consideration. If we look at, as I said, Access Info, we did 27 countries, including, for example, the United States, which is the one country that beat you. Just looking at the European countries, the 20 countries in the European Union, what is clear is that where there are European directives, where there are requirements to have laws in this field, to collect data, to publish the data, such as with public procurement data, or where we have an aspect of data governance regulated, such as data protection rules, then we see much higher scores. So it's thanks to the EU. It's thanks to EU regulations that we have more consistency of scores across Europe. When we don't have clear EU rules to collect this data, make it public, or at least to have some kind of legal framework in this field, we'll see more variability. And I think that's very useful because it gives us a kind of an agenda for talking to the European Union, to the European Commission, about what they should be doing. So if climate vulnerability data is weak, given that the EU is supposed to be working on this, given that the objective of the spending of the recovery and resilience funds is supposed to be be very much tied to a just climate transition, that's clearly one area where we need to have better regulation about the data as well. Another thing that we're seeing globally, linked to these comments about the European Union and the effect that it has within the member states, is that we're also seeing a bit of a Brussels effect, if you know that jargonistic phrase, the Brussels effect globally, insofar as when Brussels regulates things, that kind of raises the bar for the rest of the world. So fairly perhaps to be expected, but we definitely see that with data protection, more and more countries globally have data protection frameworks which meet a certain standard. And I'm quite sure that that's because in order to do trade with Europe, you have to make sure your data protection frameworks are basically in line with the general data protection regulation. So I haven't mapped out all the other possible Brussels effects, but that's one that really stands out in the data. So that gives us a little bit of a feeling. One last comment on perhaps the patterns that we're seeing around Europe is that not everyone has clear legal frameworks for open data, for governance of the data. And I think a concern is, even in a country like Estonia, which is doing well, let me just check your score on the, hang on a second, so I've got all the scores here. I was looking at it earlier. Data management, language and data governance, not good scores. Data sharing frameworks, data accessibility, medium scores. You have an open data policy, but how much is this actually set in law? How much is it more because you've been a very enthusiastic country about embracing digital technologies and opening up data? And how much is there a risk of reversal if there's a change of political will? So definitely for the European region, while there's a lot of good stuff happening with the publication of data. Ooh, is that a cat?
Cats and babies, as always.
A cat or a baby. So whilst we're seeing really good things in practice, I think they're not always supported by the strongest legal frameworks. And that's something that we should be thinking about in the future to really make sure that there aren't reversals on the things that have already been achieved.
Mm-hmm. Thank you, Helen, for this.
The patterns that we're seeing.
Yeah, that was a great introduction to discussing the results. And here I would immediately give the word to Keegan, as he was the one collecting data about Estonia. So Keegan, maybe you can guide us through Estonia's results from this data collection exercise, and maybe tell us where Estonia is doing particularly well. Where are the gaps and why are they there? Is it about that we are actually not doing well? Is it also a matter of the questions asked or the methodology? And what have been your impressions of this whole process of participating or collecting data for the survey?
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Helen, for your answers as well. It's been quite interesting to listen. I mean, I've been working with open data since I came here, 7 years ago, so since 2015. And I think in that time, there's been a huge change, not only in Estonia's progress with open data, but also in the sort of mindset around it. I mean, with the previous CIO before Siim Sikkut, you have someone saying, that open government data is so last century, it's not important, we have X-Road, we're actually so advanced, we don't actually need it. And then new ministry, new CIO, things like this sort of started to get turned around. And we have really seen a huge, let's say, leap ahead in last, I don't know, 4 or 5 years, something like that, maybe from 2017 about. So yeah, lots of progress, definitely, as we can see from the results. A few things that I want to pick up on before I go into Estonia directly. Of course, something which I find quite interesting, if I look at the methodology, is that even though use and impact is actually so important to this, it was only assigned 4% of the overall weight in the methodology. So you have 30% going to governance, 24% going to capability, 42% to availability, and then 4% to use and impact. And not only that, but use and impact was clearly the weakest score across the board. So in Estonia, we had an average of 35, or we had a score of 35.1. The world average was 22. Compare that to the other world averages: availability 30, capability 42, governance 36. So, I mean, I think this on its own is something to pay attention to. Not only for future studies, I just think it's weird if the point is to measure impact and use that it's assigned such a low weight, but that's my own thing. But across the board, this is the lowest thing, right? And so part of the question is then, you know, lots of people, especially in academia, have been asking whether or not open data actually leads to things being built, whether it actually can, you know, materialize these benefits that people are talking about. Yes, it's definitely hard to measure. I agree. So, and the questions are yeah, but besides the point, I mean, it is very hard to measure, but this is also the core question at the heart of open data is, you know, how much benefit are you actually getting from it? What impact is it actually creating? And if we're looking at Estonia, I think this is something where we got, you know, where there's a lot of room to improve upon. If we look at some of the indicators where we fared poorly, let's say, you know, use of public procurement data for analytics, or use of public procurement data visualization, so on and so forth. I see that Karina is here. So basically they have the only sort of prototype so far that was built using our prototype data, using data from the procurement register, this opener.de. And this was connected with the business registry and built together with Latvia. And there's not many really strong examples. We have some stuff if you go to the Andmeklubis portal, but nothing like really, yeah, let's say strong. If we're talking about where we got hit the hardest in terms of like points or rankings, the lowest were related to like climate data and climate vulnerability data, real-time healthcare system capacity, gender and inclusion uses of data, RTI performance, language and data governance, and data management frameworks. So if I talk a bit about each of these in turn, the climate data and climate vulnerability data, there is data, but it's only provided as part of like a UN requirement for statistics, and it wasn't in depth, and it wasn't exactly what the survey required. So this is something that Belsberg says that they're looking into and they're trying to push right now. And something that's also important to note is that during the time of the survey, they were redoing basically the website for all the ministries. And so some data that was there was not available. And I kept getting referred to basically reports that were a few years old. And they said, yes, we're working on it, it's coming. So we might see some improvement here, but let's see. I know that it features in the new, like digital society plan or
strategy,
something.
national strategy.
This thing, there's like the green sustainability and digitalization plays quite a prominent role there, or maybe not prominent, but it's in it. So we'll see. The real-time healthcare system capacity, I think a lot of people got hit by this, and everywhere else related to COVID data, especially as I've worked a lot with the COVID open data, I think we do quite okay there. And the real-time healthcare system capacity, basically it won't come, and Tehik doesn't want to do it. And so I think if that stays, that will always be zero. But that's just my own. I'm injecting a lot of personal thoughts into this as well.
That's your privilege here.
The gender and inclusion uses of data was pretty interesting. A lot of these questions came up with, I think, the land indicator, and they asked questions, for example, like in the land registry, is it possible to see like the land ownership? Does it include data about the gender of the owner? And, you know, is data related to gender being used to sort of like improve? I made some notes, so I'm just trying to look. To influence policy decisions and things like that, to increase access or to fight against discrimination and these sorts of things. The RTI performance, so this is request information data and request information performance frameworks. This is a bit weird in the Estonian context because we have this Public Information Act, so we can always get data. But the thing is, what this was measuring is, you know, how are these requests being measured? Basically, is there statistics that look at how long it takes for them to be answered? By law, there's a requirement and how long it should take, but we have no statistics to visualize it or how many requests are being made, how often they fail, how often they're, successful, so on and so forth. The language and data governance, this was a bit weird because I think the questions in the Estonian law weren't like, it's there, but it wasn't there in a way that it could be answered correctly in how the questions were formulated. Which I can maybe, I have to look at the questions again, but I remember answering that and it was a bit weird because Estonia, anyway, yeah. And then the last one is on the data management frameworks, but this is something that I believe is being worked on now as part of the sort of development strategy that has been put in place by MKM. So I think outside of that, Estonia has done quite well with making data available. We're doing very well with interoperability, of course, just due to X-Road system. If we're comparing us to other parts of Europe, the small changes recently to the sort of like lobbying already giving us some, lead, let's say, compared to the rest of the world, even though it's still not so great. We still have this lobbytegevus register, I guess, not a register, but at least the ministries have something there. It's not open, it's not sort of standardized, but it's a step in the right direction. And feel free, the anti-corruption Estonian people in here, to disagree with me, because I'm not actually sure what the updates will be to that. And yeah, I think that's the gist of it, very, very quickly and shortly.
So you got to use your privilege to criticize the methodology a bit, but that's also understandable since this is the first attempt to capture what Helen explained is really, really difficult to capture as well. How data is getting used and by whom for the public good. So there are certainly ways to improve the survey methodology as well for future editions. And I guess this is the kind of feedback that is really important as well, to be able to repeat the survey in the future, and so that the results would be meaningful and comparable. Although, of course, it is almost impossible to compare countries since the contexts are rather different. But Helen, do you have any immediate comments or reflections on what Keegan just said? Or do you want to pick up on some of the issues that he raised, maybe?
I just want to sort of add, I mean, I think that, thank you very much, Keegan. I think it was totally fair comments. And I think that, we in Access Info, having seen how people were struggling to answer some of the questions precisely, clearly, or get the data, totally understand. Totally understand that. And I do think that it's interesting. Initially, this was called a pilot. I think we should have kept that name. Because it really is a learning exercise, and there's a lot of awareness of the many things that could be improved. And I'll link that to a comment that I wanted to make about the RTI frameworks and the measuring for the measurement of RTI, of the right to information. The biggest challenge that I'm sure that all the researchers had was that you got paid very little money. Nothing like enough for the quantity of work, and the same for us in Access Info, nothing like enough for the quantity of work that really was required to do this properly. And yet, this is the largest exercise of its type that's ever been undertaken globally, with a budget of, I don't know what the total budget of it was, but a significant amount of money put into this from particularly the Canadian IDRC funding and some other funding and contributions from other organizations. I don't know what the total budget is, but it's large. It's a few $100,000, and it's larger than anything that's been done before. So that shows the scale of the challenge that we have before us in terms of getting a proper picture globally of where we are with open data, both its production, its availability, and its use. The same goes for RTI data, RTI performance. I know only too well, because this is something at Access Info we focus on very specifically. We have our RTI rating, which is, it's not funded. So we do it on a kind of volunteer basis when we've got time. And we analyze the legal frameworks. And we're actually working on a new version. My colleague Anna, who's also joined the call, Anna Wilkinson, is working currently on a new version of the RTI rating to have more precise capture of the legal framework. But the big difficulty is not knowing what's going on in the implementation of these laws at the national level, because in most countries around the world, we have at best pretty mediocre data on the number of access to information requests. You're lucky if you even get the total number per country, let alone things like the timeframes for answering, the average timeframes for responding to requesters, the exceptions that were used, the number of times people appealed, all of that. In many countries, it's simply not captured. And I know this because I've worked with both the UNESCO, which is the custodian agency for the right of access to information under the Sustainable Development Goals, and the Organization for Economic Cooperation and Development, the OECD, which has been trying to gather data on where are we with implementation of access to information laws. And they ask the governments, and the governments give them really not very complete answers. What does this require? Well, it requires obviously governments to be collecting this data better and mapping it. And I would say ideally, at some point in the future, we should have governments measuring their own data, open data performance better, so that it's easier to do this kind of survey. And the same with the right of access to information, having governments collecting far better data on the right of access to information, so that we can actually, as civil society, just collect it and analyze it and comment on it. But the amount of money that would be needed to do this kind of exercise as completely as we'd like to is far more than we're probably going to get in the next few years. But I do think we have to keep making this point. You said at the beginning, yeah, you made me laugh, Maarja, when you introduced me. You said, Helen's been working for decades on this, which is almost true, a number of decades, at least 3. But I was working on the right of access to information long before we had open data. I'm old enough to have been a sort of early adopter of email, before we had the internet, practically, before you had websites. So I've seen it all. But now we're very firmly into this 4th industrial revolution, as people call it, the information age, whatever you wish to call it. You could say we're at only the beginning. 20 years, it's nothing. The open data, when did the open data movement, open knowledge, Rufus Pollock and the people who started open knowledge, 2008, 9, around then, I think. So this is super new, 15 years at most. So maybe it's not surprising that we don't have enough data, but at the same time, 15 years isn't nothing. And if we're saying that data is so important to our modern societies in this information age, we have to get better at measuring this. And so we can do what we can from civil society, but clearly the message from this Open Data Barometer is also that the governments themselves have to get better at collecting more information.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, me and Keegan have a history of doing a bit of research together as well on open data issues, and we researched the barriers to the publication and use of open data as part of a project. And one of the issues that we discovered, which is not a big discovery, of course, but it's basically that you can note these kinds of vicious circles in the publication and use of open data. That basically, if you don't have vocal demand, you will not have supply. But if you don't have supply, people even don't know what to demand for. So political integrity data, or data about access to information and how well governments respond to citizens' requests for information, or teabenõuded in Estonian. This kind of data, maybe we're not demanding it enough, and maybe we're not demanding transparency from governments on how the legal frameworks of access to data are actually put into practice. Because in Estonia, we have an excellent public access to information law. What do you think about this, Helen? Have you seen this in other countries as well? Is this an issue?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree with you. Yes, I mean, I don't know how well you're demanding it in Estonia, but I think that it's true that as civil society, we could better coordinate with this demand. I think that's precisely why the Global Data Barometer is so useful, because we can point this out and then we can say, look, guys, come on. And although it's not supposed to be a ranking, at least we can identify the better performers and the worst ones and name and shame. It works wonders to try to get governments to move on this. So yes, I think that's our role in civil society, is to demand the data about the data, the data about transparency, the data about the right of access to information. Clearly, that's really important. And maybe in the European region, I mean, your organization there, you said 2015, is that right, that you were founded? 2016, yeah. 2016. So you're relatively young. Access Info has been doing a lot. I founded Access Info in Spain in 2006, and we've been able to contribute to really stimulating a debate here about these issues. Many other organizations working on transparency, open data related issues around Europe are relatively young. But we do have now an ecosystem of organizations in different European countries. And I think what we as civil society should do is work together to coordinate our messages a bit. And that's precisely why I mentioned at the beginning that with the launch of the Global Data Barometer, we're wanting to have a number of community conversations. And this is actually the first one, so it's fantastic to be having it, because I think it creates a model for other conversations that we can have. What have we learned? What does it tell us? What are the weaknesses? How can we improve? How can we work better together to have an impact on these problems that we identify? So yeah, I agree with you very much.
Mm-hmm. So we spoke a bit about data about access to information and how this right is exercised in practice. But one of the areas in which Estonia did quite poorly, as we already discussed a bit, is environment or climate vulnerability data. And Keegan, as you were the one collecting this data for Estonia, can you explain a bit what issues were asked about in this part of the survey, and where are the gaps in Estonia?
Well, I mean, to put it bluntly, it just doesn't exist. I mean, it probably exists somewhere, but it was not available. You know, they give you well, we probably have it somewhere, but it will take us time to find it, and we will make it available in the future. It's in the plan. So I don't remember the exact questions, but I remember talking with the Ministry of Environment quite heavily, trying to find something. And they sent statistics and that I didn't ask for. So this is the good old Estonian approach to this. I don't know, every time I have an interaction on open data, it basically goes like this. I say, I want this data. And then they send me data that I didn't actually ask for, but they think it's what I mean. And then I have to say, actually, that's cool, thank you. But I would actually like the data that I would requested. And then they say, oh yeah, that data. Well, we don't actually have that data right now. So it's just how it is. I mean, I assume that it has to do with sort of priorities and funding and so on and so forth. There is data, but the only data that they have is, you know, and as Helen was talking about earlier, that a lot of times when you have this data, it's because it belongs to, it's required, e.g. by EU law. For example, the Inspire initiative or something like that, which is the reason why we have a whole lot of, you know, land and cadastral data easily available across the EU. Similarly, if you belong to, I mean, with the healthcare system, a lot of this data is available because there are best practices and standards for statistics organizations and government. So you have, you know, statistical codes and metadata and standards, and you will find this across organizations who belong to this, because in order to belong to it, you have to meet certain standards. And so we have some data which is required basically to be reported to the UN as part of, I don't remember off the top of my head, which agreement, but it's there. But that's not necessarily what the survey asked about. So yeah, I'm trying to remember. Then there was some data that they were asking about also related to like the Red Book basically, and sort of protected species, endangered species, and these different sorts of things. And this was available, but how it's maintained is a bit different compared to other open data sources. So this is something that I hope to talk with Oth about as well. Because I think at the moment it's maintained basically out of a research group at the Tartu Ülikool. But yeah, that's something that the government says they're trying to fix. But yeah, off the top of my head, I don't remember the exact questions, unfortunately.
But I mean, regarding climate vulnerability data, where Estonia got a really low score, is this what it's supposed to basically show is to what extent is the public informed of Estonia's vulnerabilities to climate change?
This was also sort of like forecasting data. So what do you expect to happen to your country in 20 years, 30 years, 40 years, based on different sort of scenarios? You know, what could play out if the temperature changes by X? And I think, if I'm remembering correctly, this is basically what a lot of it had to deal with. But if Helen knows more, she could correct me, but that's what's coming to my mind at the moment.
Yeah, it was about natural hazards, extreme weather events, and so on. But yeah, Helen?
Yeah, and that's not always necessarily collected and processed at the national level, because there are scientists working on that globally and regionally. But it is yes, it's important data. I haven't really looked at the climate data. I don't know if my colleague Maarja wants to comment on that. I haven't looked so much at the climate vulnerability data yet to really get an exact feel for what kind of recommendations we would make. That's our plan, to look at the patterns across Europe and then see what kind of specific recommendations we can make. One thing, if you were talking to the government, Keegan, I don't know if you mentioned Ott in the government, or you said something like, sounded like, just to say that obviously next year, Estonia, you are the country which is chairing the Open Government Partnership. In fact, we're in open government. I don't know if you know this. Do you know this? I don't know if you know this or not. No one's reacting. So next year, Estonia is the chair of the co-chair with someone from civil society of the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership. Can you hear me okay?
Yeah, there were some interruptions at least. I don't know if the issue was about you and me, or
I think it was me. I'll put sorry about that. I'll put my hotspot on in a second. Can you hear me okay now?
But indeed, just to clarify, Estonia will indeed be chairing the OGP steering committee next year, and which is, I think, a great chance to advance the agenda of many countries regarding open government. And actually, there are two OITs in Estonian government who are important for this purpose. One is the OIT working for the government office, Riigikantselei, who is the national point of contact for the Open Government Partnership, and who's been working to apply for membership in the steering committee and so on. And then there's another OIT working for the Ministry of Economic Affairs and Communications, who's the government chief data officer, and who has a huge portfolio of issues relating to data management, open data, and so on. And since he joined the ministry, unfortunately, he cannot attend this event here today, but we have certainly seen a lot of progress in data publication and usage practices as well. But so, Helen, did you want to make a remark about Estonia's?
I hope my connection is better now.
Yes.
I switched to my hotspot. Sorry about that. So what I was saying was, given that Estonia will be chairing the steering committee of the Open Government Partnership, And given that in October in Rome with Italy, the current chair, there's going to be an OGP Europe regional meeting looking at the OGP strategy and the agenda setting for going forward next year, I think it could be really interesting to take some of the things that we're discussing today and that we will be discussing with people over the next few weeks from Access Info, and to take those to and propose that a focus of what we do in the European region, at least, I mean, it will be a global agenda, but there's also going to be a kind of European strategy that we actually focus on some of these issues. And maybe we could work together on setting some kind of set of priorities, looking to one or both odds in the government, and seeing if we can actually drive this agenda a little bit. I mean, that's our role at civil society, right? To do some agenda setting and to say what we need. So I would love, given the particular priority of Access Info, I would love to see governments across Europe making commitments, OGP governments, but others, making commitments to collect more data on levels of transparency in practice and conduct more research, which they should be able to afford to fund to do, conduct research into how the public is using this information so that we get a better picture on this. And I think that would, you know, we're talking about in OGP, which has just celebrated 10 years, we're talking about setting the open government agenda for the next 5 to 10 years. Well, clearly measurement of open government, which includes measurement of open data and transparency, is absolutely key, because without the data, we don't know how well we're having an impact with the work that we do. So I think there are some very interesting conversations that we could be having over the next few months in terms of that agenda setting. And I'd like to be able to count with you, given that you're talking to the government, which is the future co-chair of OGP, to be involved in that discussion.
Mm-hmm. Speaking of agenda setting, since we are reaching the end of today's short discussion as well, it is really short because there would be so many more issues to discuss. I wanted to turn to people who've been listening so far. So I see, for example, Teele here. I see Karina here. I see also Steven Christo here from Estonian civil society organizations such as Rohetiger, the Green Tiger, promoting climate change issues, and as well as Transparency Estonia, working on anti-corruption. So maybe one of you would like to propose, based on your practical experience, and perhaps even not so much based on the results of the survey, to propose issues that Estonia could tackle at the governmental level to advance data availability and data use in areas that you work on. So maybe one of you wants to propose or make a comment or even ask a question. Teele, Karina, are you still online? It's a very Estonian meeting.
This is the standard. Nobody talks, nobody turns their video on. You can just sit in silence.
Okay.
I can open the microphone then. Spoiler alert, I am no longer officially here representing TI Estonia. I'm now part of OGP, so we'll be managing the Nordic and Baltic countries. And I'll actually wanted to also leave you with a link here for a very quick Mentimeter survey on this strategy session. So if you have any initial thoughts on the open government strategy, you can just enter them right away there. But it's, of course, personally coming from an anti-corruption background and seeing that political integrity data set is one of the lowest scoring ones of the Estonian results. That's definitely something that I would personally like to see being advanced, and that's coming from my own personal experience, not the OGP itself. Just because when also Keegan mentioned opener development, then that's something that we have discussed in the previous Andmeklubi sessions as well. We've come across quite a few issues with accessing data, data standardization. Although open data is available, it's not really usable. So there's a lot of issues there that actually haven't been solved. A lot of the times I feel because there's not enough reusers. So there's this feedback loop that is missing from the data source and the users. So that's something that can be proactively also done from the side of data holders to reach out to potential users or current reusers and really see how they can better their data sets, not just tick a box that we have it in open data now.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a very valuable remark because indeed governments sometimes think that if they do make the data available, then their job is done. But in fact, what they can and should also do is promote reuse and make sure that people know this availability, well, the data is available, how it can be used, for which purposes it can be used, and so on. So sometimes there needs to be a bit more push from the government side as well, if people don't know what to demand or what the usage opportunities are. So Helen or Keegan, do you have any ideas or suggestions? I mean, going beyond the results of this survey, what the survey shows is what the situation is like, but then how should governments use the results of this survey to create their agenda on open data, on data management, on data policies more general? So what should they do? What steps should they take first?
Well, I think that, I mean, I'm a great fan of the Open Government Partnership, obviously, because I've been involved in it from the beginning and have served 2 terms on the steering committee. And but more than that, because I have the experience in Spain of seeing how the open government process and the requirement to involve civil society in discussions about the agenda setting, the commitments that have to be made, that has really transformed the relationship between civil society and relevant government officials in Spain, where we didn't have a history. Maybe it's different in Estonia or in some other countries, but including where I come from in the UK, it was easier to talk to government officials, I remember. But in Spain, there wasn't a culture of collaboration. And it's been really fascinating to see, even though it's not easy, to see how that we've got a space, a forum, where we can work together on having these discussions and setting the priorities. So obviously, with my Global Data Barometer hat on and mixing it with my OGP hat, I'd really like to see people using the results of the Global Data Barometer with certain caveats about it's not perfect, you know, but using these results and the trends that we see to inform the work that Karina, welcome, good to see you in the OGP now then, and using that to inform our discussions so that we can prioritize. But it needs to be done as processes which involve civil society, the participation dimension of open government, because that way we get better policies, particularly in this new field. So that's what I'd really like to see governments doing. I mean, the Estonian government could help encourage that amongst other European governments. And if we're finishing now-ish, is that right? This finishes, yes. Well, in that case, I'm just going to take the opportunity, if I may, Maarja, to say one last thing, a kind of alert, a warning. We really need to be talking a lot more about the relationship between open data and data protection, personal data protection, because we are increasingly seeing significant problems and probably a closing down of access to certain data sets that contain the names of individuals because of concerns about being in line with the General Data Protection Regulation, including data which I think that those of us who work on government accountability, anti-corruption, be it recipients of farm subsidies or lobbying, names of lobbyists or whatever, data we really think should be public. So we're going to have a challenge there over the next few years, getting that balancing right and keeping certain data sets open. There's a court case going on right now at the European Court of Justice, which could have very negative consequences for many of our data sets. It's about beneficial ownership data, but it could have consequences for other data sets. So I think that all of us working in this field, Access Info, we actually created a working group of legal experts, and we had our first meeting of that working group yesterday. So and we don't have clear answers for you yet. It was a first meeting. But our plan is to keep bringing in the legal experts so that we, in the transparency open data community, are up to date with the latest legal arguments so that we can be sure that government officials who are afraid of doing the wrong thing, because it's often fear that prevails, and they're worried about getting it wrong, and that's sometimes a reason for not releasing data, that doesn't actually cause us to not have progress or even to have backtracking in a way that's actually not necessary. So that would be something that I think we should also all really be attentive to. You're on mute.
Sorry. Thank you, Helen, for raising this extremely important issue. And I have the same feeling that it's something that it's going to be increasingly important. And actually, it will be interesting to see how the global data barometer will also capture these developments in the next years. But whether this tension, how it will play out, will there be more openness, more closeness, or completely new approaches combining both data protection, personal data protection, and openness and open data? So Keegan, do you have any last comments or remarks, especially regarding some of the important issues that the global data barometer raises, and perhaps future trends or current issues more generally? What should we pay attention to? What should we watch out for when working with and observing developments in the data field in Estonia and in the world as well?
Yeah, so I think I have just a few bullet points here of things that are important and should be paid attention to. The first is that there's more to this ecosystem than just public sector and citizens. Private sector also has a huge role to play in all of this. And actually the private sector is probably one of the biggest users of open data in the world. Let's take Google Maps. This runs basically utilizing GTFS, which is the global transport, or GTSF, global transport specification feed. So governments create data, they make it available. Google Maps uses this. Address data, geospatial data, satellite data. This is often used by the private sector, depending where you are on the world, but it's going to become increasingly important. And if we're talking about actually getting sort of stronger, innovative impact from open data. So this is one thing, is that we need to pay attention to the whole ecosystem. Of course, citizens, civil society, all this is very important as well. The second thing that I wanted to say is that global data barometer, governments really like checklists. Don't take this as a checklist. Like, it's not enough to say, okay, now we have this data problem solved, which we have seen a lot of the time. It's rather, let's make sure that this data is the right data, that it's being used, that it's not just sort of trying to check boxes, but it needs to be accompanied by the sort of necessary organizational transformation and mental model changes and so on and so forth. And then another thing that I think is really interesting, and something that I have read at least one paper about, is this idea of sort of like, let's say, faux openness or autocratic openness, which is that there are certain countries in the world which like to game indices such as this one, to Dubai being UAE being a very good example of this, where they actually score very, very well when it comes to open data. And so what this, I don't remember the name of the paper exactly at the moment, but what they're looking at is how governments are actually, especially if you combine it in a period of democratic backsliding, you have governments which are opening up data and they're making it look more open, but they're constraining openness in other aspects. So I think this will be something really interesting to follow in the future, because I have a feeling it will get more important. So if we put all of this together, what does that tell you? We need to take this ecosystem perspective. We need to understand the necessary mental model changes. We need to understand the necessary organizational changes. We need to understand the rather broader innovation ecosystem, which is the sort of network and feedback loops between private sector, public sector, citizens, society itself. And at some point, we also need to be asking ourselves the question whether or not people actually want to use this data. It's one thing to make data available. It's another to make data available that nobody actually cares about and then try to shove it down people's throats saying, we made this available for you, now use it, now use it, now use it, now use it, when maybe 2 or 3 people are actually interested in it. So there needs to be a balance between just making everything available and talking with people, understanding what they actually want to use, making the most important data available first, accompanying this with examples, with strong use cases, being able to demonstrate it further why this is important. And I think only then you'll start to see this impact. But yeah, that's my little spiel about open data, I guess. I see Helen raising her hand, so.
Could I just come in on one short point there? I agree with everything you said, but just to put a sort of bit of a nuance on the question of the number of people using the data. Yeah. It's possible that certain data sets are only going to be used by a handful of investigative journalists or environmental organizations or anti-corruption organizations, maybe only 2 or 3 in a particular country, but it's absolutely crucial.
Yeah.
They'll put it together, map it, mix it with other data, do their journalistic stories, or identify problems in the public procurement system that need to be rectified, or whatever it might be. And so it's not always the quantity of users that is relevant, right?
Yeah, I misspoke there. It's, you're definitely right to call me out on that, because I have made this point so many times in my own papers. It's people like to talk about the number of data sets they have available, the number of people who are accessing it, but that actually really doesn't tell you anything about the actual impact or the use. And sometimes it might just be 2 people using it, and that is all different. So yeah, you're definitely right, and I agree with you on that.
We need to be able to know which are the data sets which are being used in a way that's having an impact, and which are the ones that are really just sitting there and nobody's looking at them.
Yep.
Because it's a lot of work.
I mean, to give an example from Estonia, because we were all there when, well, not all of us, but many of us in this room were there when this was happening, is we need to have more data sets because this is what's ranked on certain things, right? So what do? You take a data set that exists from 1980 to 2010, and you say data set A 1980, data set B 1981. So instead of 1 data set encapsulating 30 years, I have 30 data sets of 1 year each. And governments really like to do things like this. And that's not just Estonia, it's everywhere. So it's just something, it's also about measuring and creating better indicators, and which is why things like Open Government, the Global Data Barometer are quite important, I think. So.
Exactly, you get what you measure. That's always the case. But indeed, the Global Data Barometer, I think, is at least trying to overcome this problem and to bring in the aspect of public value as well, in terms of what data should be published. But since we are really running out of time right now, I'm really glad that you both made the remark about feedback loops, and actually Karina was the one to also raise this issue, and about conversations. We do need more conversations between data providers, data users, data intermediaries, to really get adequate feedback on what data is necessary, who uses it for which purpose. And even if it's just a couple of users, but they create a lot of economic or social value out of this, then this is data that probably should be available. But then regarding conversations, it looks like today's discussion and then the results of the global data barometer do raise a number of issues that we can basically use to guide our next conversations in the Data Club series to zoom in on specific aspects of this study. Of data use and publication practices and where the world of data is going. So I'm really happy for the points that you raised, for the input, for the food for thought that you gave today. And I'm really, really glad that Helen could be here, that Keegan could be here, and that there are still people who haven't left us despite going over time. So there will be a recording of this discussion available later as well, which we will share online as well with those who couldn't attend today. And I see a comment from Karina. Indeed, we are all glad that the barometer is out and that it, with the gaps and the problems that it has, it still, I'm sure, will be a really valuable instrument in the future to guide the work that both governments and civil society and private sector are doing in countries. So thank you all. I will use my privilege to end this meeting now. And let's keep the conversation going in next Data Club events. Okay.
Yep. Thanks.
See you soon. Bye-bye.
Yeah, ciao.
Everybody, yeah. Have a good afternoon. Bye-bye.